My name is Tina, and this is the first time I've sat down to tell this story from start to finish. I've often thought about writing it out, or maybe even recording my voice just to clear my head. Sometimes, late at night when the kids are asleep, I feel like I'm drowning in these memories. My therapist says speaking openly might ease my heart. So here I am. I turned 42 this past April, but most days I feel older than that. It's not the kind of age you celebrate wildly, especially when you're raising 2 teenagers alone. My daughter Sophie is 15 and full of gentle rebellion, and my son Jake is 17, already carrying the shadow of a man he'll become. Watching them grow without their dad has been one of the hardest things I've ever had to endure. Russell was everything to me. We met in college, and from the first day I saw him, he seemed like someone I'd known forever. Tall and strong, with dark hair and quiet eyes that always made me feel seen. He had a knack for making others laugh, yet always reserved his tender side just for me. We married young, built a little world of our own in a quiet suburb of Denver, and soon after, we welcomed Jake, and then Sophie 2 years later. Life felt secure, steady, and beautiful. Then, 7 years ago, Russell died in a car accident, and our world shattered overnight. I remember police lights illuminating the windows, the somber knock on the door at 3 a.m, the awful feeling when I knew, deep inside, something dreadful had happened. People say grief gets easier, but they're wrong. Grief only changes shape. You learn to carry it better, like a heavy stone worn smooth by constant handling. After Russell passed, I devoted myself entirely to our kids. I didn't need a job. He'd always ensured we'd be comfortable, but I threw myself into every aspect of their lives to keep busy. PTA meetings, bake sales, soccer games, cheerleading practices. My routine became a lifeline. My friends suggested dating again, but I brushed it off. Russell's memory felt too vivid, too sacred to ever replace. Recently, Sophie and Jake visited Russell's brother Trevor in Arizona. It was supposed to be an olive branch, a chance for them to reconnect with family they'd barely known. Trevor and Russell hadn't spoken for nearly 15 years, long before Russell passed away. Their disagreement had been serious. Russell deeply trusted Trevor but felt let down after an inheritance issue involving their parents' house and joint investments. Trevor took more than his fair share and wasn't honest about it. Russell, hurt by the situation, decided it was best to distance himself. Even after Russell's passing, Trevor never reached out. Still, I hoped that perhaps time had softened feelings, that maybe Trevor regretted the past and wanted to reconnect through the kids. Despite my uncertainties, I agreed to let Jake and Sophie visit him. When they returned, something felt off, although at first, I couldn't quite say what it was. A mother notices these things. One morning, while eating breakfast, Sophie hesitantly mentioned something Uncle Trevor had said. She was quiet at first, playing with her cereal and looking to Jake for support. "What is it, Soph?" I gently encouraged. She finally shared that Trevor had described Russell as financially irresponsible, saying he'd borrowed money from family and made poor investments, even suggesting he'd gambled some away. Jake reluctantly nodded, adding that Trevor's wife, Allison, implied I had known about Russell's supposed mistakes and supported them. My heart dropped, and for a moment I felt dizzy, emotions welling up inside me. These statements weren't true. Russell had always been responsible, careful, and trustworthy. I knew firsthand how diligently he handled our finances. Gambling? That was completely out of character and deeply unfair. It seemed Trevor was reshaping the past, influencing innocent children to see their father, an honest, good man, as irresponsible. All of this, perhaps, to justify Trevor's own past actions. I managed to stay calm in front of Jake and Sophie, holding back my frustration. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. Memories of Russell's hurt over the situation with Trevor and the sadness he felt at losing a relationship with his brother came flooding back. Trevor had taken from us before, and now he was damaging Russell's memory in our children's eyes. It felt as though we were losing Russell again, a pain deeper than any financial issue. By the next morning, after a restless night pacing the kitchen, I'd made up my mind. Trevor needed to address this, and I wasn't going to let our family be hurt again. This wasn't about revenge. It was justice, plain and simple. Russell couldn't defend himself anymore, but I was here, alive, angry, and ready to protect his memory at any cost. I didn't yet know how, but I promised myself Trevor would regret ever crossing us again. I'd always been someone who chose peace over confrontation. After Russell died, I clung to harmony like a raft. But that morning, after hearing how Trevor had twisted the truth and stained Russell's memory, I felt an anger unlike anything I'd experienced before. It was controlled, focused, almost eerily calm. For once, I understood how some mothers could move mountains to protect their families. The first step was gathering facts. I started by contacting our old family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a kindly man in his 70s who'd handled our finances and Russell's estate. He'd been with us through thick and thin, and the shock on his face when I explained Trevor's accusations said everything. Over coffee in his small, cluttered office, Mr. Thompson confirmed what I already knew. Russell had never gambled, never squandered family money. Instead, it was Trevor who had drained their parents' accounts, leaving Russell to quietly cover their living expenses until they both passed away. Why didn't Russell ever take legal action? I asked, frustration seeping into my voice. Mr. Thompson adjusted his glasses, looking weary. Your husband chose family over money. He hoped Trevor would one day come around, apologize. But instead, Trevor's lies just became more elaborate. Hearing this filled me with resolve. Russell's silence, his dignity, had been taken advantage of. It was time someone stood up for him. Next, I turned my attention to Trevor's life in Arizona. It didn't take much digging to see he and Allison had constructed an impressive facade. Social media depicted a lavish existence. Fancy cars, designer clothes, luxury vacations. Trevor ran a small insurance agency, doing moderately well, but nowhere near enough to justify their lifestyle. It seemed suspicious, especially given his history. I began discreetly reconnecting with old acquaintances and distant relatives. Most shared similar stories. Trevor had distanced himself from almost everyone after the fallout with Russell, isolating Allison and himself in a bubble of lies. They occasionally borrowed money, rarely paying it back, all while maintaining an appearance of wealth and respectability. It was clear to me that Trevor's dishonesty wasn't just a single incident. It was becoming a habit. At first, I thought about confronting him directly, but quickly decided against it. He would probably twist my words or dismiss my concerns altogether. If I wanted real resolution, I'd need patience, clarity, and perhaps wait for Trevor's own carelessness to catch up with him. My chance came unexpectedly. One evening, while scrolling through Facebook, I noticed a local Arizona news story shared by someone Trevor knew. It discussed recent investigations into insurance fraud affecting various local companies. A prominent insurance agent had recently been questioned, and authorities hinted more investigations were underway. Instantly, my intuition kicked in. Could Trevor be involved in something similar? Over the next few days, I discreetly reached out to a private investigator recommended by Mr. Thompson. Within 2 weeks, he confirmed my suspicion. Trevor was indeed being reviewed for possible insurance fraud. Apparently, for years he'd been submitting questionable claims, collecting generous commissions from inflated policies, and using the money for personal luxuries. Authorities were quietly gathering evidence against him. Trevor had been cautious, covering his tracks carefully, but his confidence eventually made him careless. The investigator explained that Trevor frequently used company money on personal expenses, labeling them as business-related trips or client meetings. He'd even cleared gambling debts using these funds, ironically enough, since he'd falsely accused Russell of similar habits. It was shocking to see Trevor involved in the very thing he'd accused others of. The investigator handed me a detailed report outlining Trevor's actions, strong enough to help authorities complete their investigation much faster. Holding this information, I realized this was exactly the proof I'd been waiting for. Before sharing this information officially, I decided Trevor should first face the consequences socially. Using an anonymous email, I prepared a discreet summary of Trevor's questionable practices, complete with supporting evidence, and quietly sent it to some of his closest associates and key clients. Not enough to impede the legal investigation, just enough to unravel Trevor's carefully crafted image. The response was swift. Within days, gossip spread through his community. Trevor lost clients, friends distanced themselves, and Allison frantically tried to manage the fallout. Their glamorous life began visibly unraveling. Then, at precisely the right moment, I anonymously delivered the complete dossier to Arizona authorities. I watched from afar as Trevor's fraudulent empire crumbled piece by piece, his reputation irrevocably destroyed. Allison, who'd gladly spread lies about Russell and me, suddenly found herself shunned by the society she desperately courted. Their hypocrisy was laid bare, undeniable. I never spoke a word to Trevor, never confronted him directly. Instead, I allowed him and Allison to experience the pain and humiliation they'd so thoughtlessly inflicted on others. When the authorities finally came knocking, Trevor had no choice but to surrender, admitting guilt to charges that would land him in prison. It was poetic justice at its finest. As for me, I felt a deep peace settling over me, knowing I'd protected Russell's memory, honored his integrity, and shielded our children from further pain. But justice, I learned, had its own quiet consequences, and mine were just beginning. In the days following Trevor's arrest, I felt an odd sense of relief and anxiety blending together inside me. My carefully constructed retaliation had worked perfectly. Trevor's picture appeared on local Arizona news channels, a disheveled shadow of the arrogant man who'd once so smugly accused Russell of wrongdoing. His insurance license was revoked, his assets frozen, and his name publicly disgraced. Friends distanced themselves, pretending they'd never known him, and Allison fled to her parents' home in California, unable to face the humiliation. Yet, my satisfaction quickly gave way to unease. As news reached Jake and Sophie, their initial shock soon turned into confusion. I hadn't anticipated how complicated their emotions would be. Trevor might have deceived them, but he was still family, blood-bound by an invisible, resilient thread. Sophie withdrew into silence, spending hours alone in her room, while Jake grew moody and distant. I knew I had to address it before resentment could fester. One evening, I gathered the courage to talk openly with them. We sat around our worn kitchen table, the hum of the fridge and gentle ticking of the clock filling uneasy silences. "I know this is hard," I began gently. "Seeing family this way, it's painful." Jake spoke first, bitterness tinging his voice. "Why did Uncle Trevor lie about Dad? He knew how much it hurt us." "Because," I sighed deeply, choosing honesty. It was easier than facing his own mistakes. Trevor always wanted more than he had. When he couldn't get it honestly, he took it from those he loved. Your father stood in his way. Sophie looked at me, her blue eyes brimming with tears. "But Mom, does revenge make us better? You taught us forgiveness." Her words pierced deep, shaking my resolve. I had justified my actions as justice, not revenge, but suddenly I questioned whether my intentions had been purely righteous or if hidden anger had driven me too far. Had I become more like Trevor than I'd intended? Sleep became difficult. Nights were long and filled with second-guessing. Memories of Russell replayed endlessly, his gentle laugh, patient eyes, calm strength. Would he have approved of my choices, or had I dishonored his memory by stooping to Trevor's level? During these restless nights, I searched within myself. My intentions, I'd convinced myself, were noble. But the discomfort gnawed at me, relentless and accusing. One afternoon, while sorting old photos, I stumbled upon a letter Russell had written shortly before his death. It was tucked in a shoebox, forgotten among birthday cards and vacation souvenirs. The letter was addressed to Trevor but never sent. My heart raced as I carefully unfolded the paper, recognizing Russell's neat handwriting. In that letter, Russell spoke candidly of his deep disappointment in Trevor, but also of forgiveness. "I refuse to let bitterness poison our lives," he wrote, his words graceful and dignified. "Life is too short, Trevor. Someday, I hope you realize that truth and family are more valuable than pride and possessions." The words broke something inside me, shattering my righteous anger. Russell had chosen grace, even in pain. Had I betrayed his legacy by letting bitterness consume me? I shared the letter with Jake and Sophie that evening. As they read, their faces softened, anger melting away into quiet understanding. Russell's wisdom echoed in that small kitchen, guiding us back toward peace. He was still teaching us, long after his death. We talked openly, sharing tears, embracing forgiveness. Sophie hugged me tightly, whispering, "Dad would be proud of you, Mom. You protected him and us. But maybe now we can let go." Jake nodded, his voice steadier, more mature. "Maybe forgiveness doesn't mean Uncle Trevor deserves it. Maybe it just means we deserve peace." My children were wiser than I'd ever been, helping me see clearly again. Trevor had been wrong, and he was paying dearly. But our peace didn't depend on his suffering. It depended on our own ability to move forward, refusing to let bitterness take root. In the weeks that followed, we slowly found our footing again. I sent Trevor a short letter, carefully worded and free of anger, simply stating that I hoped he might someday understand the true meaning of family and honesty. There was no reply, and I didn't expect one. I wrote it for myself, for my children, and in honor of Russell's gentle wisdom. Life began to stabilize, finding rhythm again in simple routines. Sophie returned to cheerleading, Jake focused on college applications, and I started volunteering at a local charity, something Russell had always encouraged. Helping others brought new perspective and purpose. Then, unexpectedly, I received news that Trevor wanted to speak with me directly. His lawyer called, asking cautiously if I'd consider meeting him. Initially hesitant, I wondered if facing him would reopen wounds just beginning to heal. Yet deep inside, I knew closure required courage. Russell had chosen compassion and grace. Now, 7 years after losing him, it was finally my turn to embody those same values, stepping forward with dignity and forgiveness. For myself, for my children, and for the man who'd always been our moral compass, I agreed to face Trevor one final time. The day I met Trevor was humid and overcast, as if the weather itself sensed the tension awaiting me. The prison was a stark, gray building, ringed by razor wire and harsh lights. Even as I walked through security, I doubted myself. Could I really face him without feeling hatred rise again? But I remembered Russell's letter, his gentle spirit guiding me forward. A guard led me into a small visitation room, sterile and brightly lit. I took a seat on a stiff plastic chair and waited, my heart thudding. Moments later, Trevor entered. He looked diminished, pale, thinner than I remembered. His shoulders slumped and his eyes lacked their old arrogance. When he saw me, he hesitated, visibly unsure how to approach. "Tina," he finally said quietly, awkwardly sitting down across from me. "Trevor." My voice stayed steady, calmer than I felt. Silence stretched painfully until he spoke again. "I didn't think you'd come. Honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you hadn't." I studied him carefully. His eyes held genuine shame, something I never thought I'd witness. "I came because Russell would have," I replied softly. "Not for you, Trevor, but because holding on to anger was poisoning me." Trevor nodded slowly, gaze fixed on the table. "I wanted to apologize in person, Tina, for everything. I lied to your children. I lied about Russell and what I did years ago, taking what wasn't mine. I regret it every day now. Losing Russell was harder than I admitted, but instead of grieving properly, I made him a villain. It was cowardly, and it hurt all of you." The sincerity in his voice startled me. Years of bitterness had stripped him down to this, a humbled man finally confronting his own sins. Yet, something inside me still resisted sympathy. I'd seen firsthand the damage he'd done, the confusion he'd sown in Jake and Sophie's hearts. "Why did you lie to my children?" My tone sharpened slightly. "You hurt them deeply, Trevor. They barely remember their father clearly. You stole even those fragile memories." He winced, genuine remorse flickering through his eyes. "I was afraid. Afraid that they'd see through me. Afraid they'd ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. So I tried rewriting history, but that doesn't excuse it. I realize now what I've done. I'm ashamed, Tina." A tense silence hung between us. I could sense his regret, genuine and raw, but it didn't erase years of damage. Yet, sitting there, I felt a strange shift within myself. Trevor wasn't the villainous figure I'd imagined, just a deeply flawed, broken man who had caused immeasurable harm out of selfishness and pride. "I read a letter Russell wrote you," I admitted gently, breaking the silence. "He forgave you, even after everything. He still hoped you'd change. That says more about him than either of us." Tears welled suddenly in Trevor's eyes, catching me off guard. "Russell was always better than me," he whispered hoarsely. "I spent years resenting him for that. The irony is, he would have helped me if I'd asked." "Yes," I agreed quietly. "He would have." Trevor inhaled deeply, seeming to gather courage. "I can't change what happened, Tina, But I want you to know something. I'm pleading guilty to everything. I'm going to prison for a long time. And honestly, I deserve it. But I want your forgiveness, not because I deserve that, but because you deserve to be free from hating me." His words startled me. For the first time, he'd considered someone else's pain. My anger receded further, replaced by a quiet sadness. Russell had once said forgiveness was not about excusing the guilty, but freeing ourselves from bitterness. Only now did I truly understand what he meant. "Trevor," I finally said, voice trembling slightly, "I forgive you. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because Russell taught me grace, and I owe that to myself and my children." He let out a shaky breath, shoulders sagging. "Thank you, Tina. It means more than you can imagine. I promise, from now on, I'll live honestly, even if it's behind bars." When I left that room, I felt lighter than I had in years. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it allowed me to reclaim my future. Jake and Sophie noticed immediately. Over dinner that evening, I told them about the visit, sharing Trevor's remorse openly. "I forgave him," I explained, holding their gazes steadily. "Not because he earned it, but because we deserve peace. Because that's how Dad would have wanted us to live." Sophie smiled softly, eyes glistening. Jake nodded thoughtfully, maturity settling into his expression. "You did the right thing, Mom," he said simply, gently squeezing my hand. From that day forward, our family began healing in earnest. We spoke freely of Russell, his kindness, his patience, his lessons on compassion. Bitterness gave way to gratitude. We honored him by living as he taught us, authentically, compassionately, courageously. Months passed, and our lives found new rhythm. Sophie flourished, Jake chose a college nearby, and I discovered genuine happiness again, freed from the shadows I'd carried for so long. Occasionally, I thought about Trevor, now serving his sentence, stripped of everything he once valued. But bitterness no longer stirred in me. Instead, I felt a quiet hope that he too might find peace and redemption. Russell had once taught me the hardest lessons come from our darkest moments. Now, years later, I finally understood what he meant. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing. It was simply about choosing peace. As time moved steadily forward, life began to reveal itself again in gentle ways I'd almost forgotten. Jake was now fully absorbed in his first semester of college, calling home every weekend, excited about new friendships and new ambitions. Sophie had blossomed too, her quiet rebelliousness softening into graceful confidence. Watching them both find their way made my heart swell, finally able to truly enjoy these precious moments without the lingering shadow of bitterness. I found myself immersed in volunteering, helping other women navigate grief and loss. Sharing my own journey brought new meaning to my life. There was a profound beauty in using my experiences to lift others, honoring Russell's memory by spreading the compassion and wisdom he'd once shared with me. Occasionally, updates about Trevor filtered into our lives. He remained in prison, quietly serving his sentence. But I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd genuinely changed. He had begun mentoring younger inmates, openly sharing his story as a cautionary tale, warning them about the consequences of dishonesty and pride. His lawyer reached out once more, sharing that Trevor was determined to live with integrity, even behind bars. Though it didn't erase past harm, it offered me a quiet sense of peace. Perhaps Russell's legacy had reached even the darkest corners. One summer afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything had unfolded, I decided to return to Arizona to visit Russell's grave, a ritual I'd done less frequently as years passed. The cemetery was peaceful, bathed in golden sunlight filtering through trees. Sitting quietly beside Russell's headstone, I reflected on how much had changed, how far we'd all come. I felt his presence, gentle and reassuring, almost as if he were softly smiling beside me. "You were right," I whispered, my voice blending with the gentle rustle of leaves. Forgiveness was always the answer. It just took me longer to understand. As I rose to leave, I noticed a woman hesitantly approaching the cemetery gate. At first, I didn't recognize her until she drew nearer, and my heart paused briefly in recognition. It was Allison. She was dressed simply, her expression weary yet somehow softer than I remembered. She saw me and paused uncertainly, clearly surprised. After a tense moment, she stepped forward, hesitant but determined. "Tina," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Allison," I replied, carefully neutral but curious. "It's been a long time." She nodded slowly, eyes filled with quiet regret. "I've wanted to apologize for a while now, for everything Trevor and I did. I lost sight of myself and hurt so many people." I studied her silently, sensing genuine sincerity beneath her fragile composure. I felt no bitterness, no anger, just calm acceptance. "We all lost sight at some point," I admitted gently. "But it doesn't have to define us forever." Allison's eyes filled with sudden tears, relief washing over her face. "I'm sorry, Tina. Truly sorry. Losing everything was painful, but it forced me to face who I'd become. I understand now what Russell saw in you. You're stronger than all of us." "No," I said softly, smiling faintly. "I'm just someone who learned from pain, like everyone else." She offered a hesitant smile in return. "Trevor has changed too. He's finally become the man he pretended to be all those years." "I've heard," I said, nodding slowly. "Maybe his journey will help others." "I hope so," Allison whispered. "Thank you for forgiving us, even though we never deserved it." "Forgiveness isn't about what anyone deserves," I answered warmly, echoing Russell's wisdom. "It's about choosing peace over bitterness." We parted quietly, neither needing more words. As Allison walked away, I felt a final weight lift from my shoulders. Russell's gentle spirit had healed wounds I once thought impossible to close. Returning home, I felt renewed, lighter somehow, free to truly embrace happiness again. Jake and Sophie greeted me warmly, unaware of the profound moment I just experienced. We spent the evening laughing together over dinner, enjoying simple pleasures. In that moment, I realized I'd fully reclaimed my life, not in spite of pain, but because I'd allowed myself to grow through it. That night, I sat quietly on our porch, watching stars scattered across the velvet sky. The silence around me was comforting, filled with memories no longer tinged by sorrow. I knew Russell would always be part of us, woven gently into the fabric of our lives. And somehow, that thought no longer brought sadness, only a deep, abiding gratitude. Life had taught me its hardest lessons in ways I'd never expected, but through them, I'd discovered resilience, compassion, and above all, forgiveness. As I closed my eyes, listening to the distant hum of crickets, I smiled softly, finally at peace. Russell would always be with me, not as a painful reminder of loss, but as a guiding star, lighting my path forward.